Hello. Today we're pleased to be interviewing Professor Dr. Ruth Rubio Marín. Welcome, and many thanks for being here with us at the European University Institute in Fiesole. And thank you for your Max Weber lecture yesterday evening, the masterclass today, and now our interview.
Okay, I will introduce first our speaker. We are talking today with Professor Ruth Rubio Marín, who is adjunct professor at the School of Transnational Governance at the EUI. She leads here the work on gender, diversity, and governance. She also is a professor of constitutional law at the University of Seville, and she holds the UNESCO Chair in Human Rights and Interculturalism at the Universidad Internacional de Andalucía. Her most recent book, Global Gender Constitutionalism and Women's Citizenship, A Struggle for Transformative Inclusion, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2022.
Dr. Rubio Marín has long took normative stances on who should have rights, focused especially on immigrants, but also emigrants, and women. We're so grateful that you'll share some of your insights and your research over the years with us here today. I'm Vicky Finn, a Max Weber Fellow at the EUI at the Robert Schuman Center.
And I am Karolina Kocemba. I am Max Weber Fellow in the Department of Law at the EUI. To start the interview, Vicky will start with reflecting on some of your past research. Then I will move to your recent work.
Great. So let's start with your book, moving a bit in the past, back in the year 2000, Immigration as Democratic Challenge, in which you argued normatively that immigrants should have access to citizenship and access to political rights, regardless of legal status. So here at the EUI, there's some current data on topics as this that's showing that access has spread across the world. Listeners can find such information at the Global Citizenship Observatory, GlobalCit, on the website globalcit.eu/databases. And these are, for example, on national electoral laws and the citizenship law dataset, and forthcoming the dyadic citizenship dataset. So these data sets deal with rights for both immigrants and emigrants, and this is where I'll start to ask some of our questions. So looking 20 years on, more than 20 years on from this book, you were a pioneer in arguing for more inclusion, which has become a reality for some immigrants, for example, accessing different kinds of social or economic or political rights, and also access to dual citizenship. However, this access has come alongside, of course, more requirements and increased requirements such as tests, language and integration tests, application fees have increased, which restricts access to other migrants. So while access could be higher on paper, sometimes in practice, it's not really available for everyone. So I'm wondering a bit about your thoughts on the development of citizenship and political rights over these years in relation to these original normative arguments that you made in 2000.
Well, thank you for having me, both to deliver the Max Weber lecture, the master class, and now for the opportunity of this interview. And it's actually very nice because you're talking about my first book, and you will be talking about my last book. And the first book is the book that came out of my PhD research at the UI. So it's very symbolically charged. Now, what I tried to do in that book was to push forward an argument whereby systems that call themselves democracies should have a sort of a safety, safety valve, whereby no matter what your status, what your legal status was, after a certain time of residence, nothing should matter. You should be able to enjoy the same rights as anyone else. This was not to imply that there couldn't be, some kinds of immigrants that could have faster access to some rights, I didn't focus myself so much on that, rather this idea, this kind of residual safety valve to say, if you don't have that kind of system, what distinguishes you from, Athenian democracy, which really, was a democracy, but only for a very small circumscribed group, right? You cannot endlessly have a society with second-tier individuals that are not given, rights, including political rights. So that was my claim at the time. Now, I think you're right to celebrate that to some extent there's been moves in that direction, especially at the local level, certainly in the EU, with the notion of EU citizenship, sometimes linked to reciprocal treaties of reciprocity. I give suffrage rights to your nationals if you do the same with my nationals. And sometimes in relation to national or cultural affiliations, often linked to colonial pasts. So there's been some progress. Now I'm talking specifically about political rights in that direction. It's still limited. I learned from you, because you're much more versatile than I am with the last data, that it's only 5 countries that grant full suffrage rights, including national suffrage, to all non-citizen residents. So we're still talking about a minority of countries, a small minority of countries, but there's been some evolution in that direction, which I celebrate. But I think you're right in saying that to some extent, this has come at a price of being more selective in who makes it to be a resident to start with. Some of the tests that you're referring to, the language test, the integration test, used to be tests that were used by countries at the very last step, the naturalization step. And you've seen countries more and more using those tests as tests to be granted permanent residence permit, or even to enter the country. The idea of integration abroad. I mean, believe it or not, it sounds like an oxymoron, but some countries have gone for the idea that, you need to know the language and show knowledge with the culture even before you enter the country. So I think you're right in pointing out that there's been that tension between, expanding in some ways, although still modest ways in my understanding, but at the same time being more selective. Now, how do I feel about this selectivity? I don't want to discard some of the reasons countries may have for being selective. So let me just put two ideas there. And that's, I think that, regarding countries that we colonized in the past, I think you can make a reparation type of argument that because we have been building our resources and our richness on the basis in part of colonial extraction, I don't think, it's utterly wrong to say, we're going to, privilege in, citizens coming from those countries. I don't think that is intrinsically something completely wrong. I also understand that there's integration needs in a society. And so I think that, the fact that you may, privilege or give some privilege to individuals who have a certain degree of cultural affinity is completely wrong. I do, however, insist, I haven't moved my normative position in the 20 years, that ultimately, even if you create some fast tracks or some privilege, you would need to morally justify why you do that. And what I'm saying is I think there's possible moral justifications for some of those distinctions, not necessarily for all. But even if you do that, ultimately you still should have that safety valve and say, after X years in the country, no distinction should still hold, because otherwise what you're doing is you're perpetuating an underclass of, denizens, or however you want to call it.
Thanks so much. That's, I completely agree, and I think a lot of other people have made similar arguments, like Rainer Baubach. We spoke about his stakeholder citizenship, and ultimately it comes down, as you kind of were getting to, for example, in the EU, that lets other EU migrants vote in local elections, but there's always the exclusion part. So while we talk a lot about inclusion, those excluded are third country nationals in this example, and the second tier. So whereas the reparations make a lot of sense, and these bilateral agreements perhaps, could you speak a little bit of the inclusion-exclusion part of like how these would apply, for example, to the EU and excluding third country nationals, even after a long period of time?
Yeah, no, I am one of those scholars who thinks that the idea of European citizenship should go a bit further, right? That if you create an area of free movement, it should be a free movement of citizens. So people that you consider citizens, or at least, people who consider who can have citizenship rights, right? Whether you grant them nationality or not is a separate question, but at least they should have full equal rights. So I think that, it's very difficult to sustain that, you can have workers moving around, but you don't, but these are just workers, these aren't citizens. I think that's an inner contradiction. And I think that EU's democratic credentials would be strengthened if we tied full rights, including voting rights, to residents, right? Now, I actually go all the way in my normative, proposals, because I also think that there may be valid democratic reasons for limiting the voting rights of nationals living abroad after a certain time. I think that if you're a national, you always should retain the possibility to go back to your country. But I don't necessarily see why, if you leave your country for good, 20 years after, you're still deciding on the policies and the taxation and the rules that are binding on people, who aren't you. So I just think that, the notion of being affected by the laws, no representation without participation, or, no taxation without participation. I do believe that there is something very basic. These are the laws that are going to be imposed on you. And it's a basic tenet of liberal thought that you need the consent of the people to legitimize government. And so I think that, there's ways to deal with that. You could have like a latent nationality where you keep your nationality, but you're not actively exercising the rights. We use residence requirements for suffrage, for local suffrage almost everywhere, right? You vote in the municipality where you live. You don't vote in another municipality. And that has a certain logic, which I think, should be expanded and extended, right? So I actually think that, yes, that we should be, looking at permanent residence or sufficient residence as a criteria, both to decide who's in and out, and that should trump over nationality.
Great, thank you. Yeah, to avoid the over-inclusion, and I mean, you were talking about immigrants abroad in the first generation, but in the end, a lot of countries continue in the second and third and so on, and who have either no ties or have never even lived in the country, don't speak the language, are still voting, like here in Italy. So to take it a little bit farther away from Europe, and I know that a lot of, constitutional law and the points of view and the liberal thought you were just talking about, take it a little bit farther away from consolidated democracies, and we know that there's inclusion and exclusion and othering in all kinds of countries and all types of political regimes. So I was wondering, for listeners and people who are studying outside of, for example, US and EU or the global North, how can scholars and students take your arguments and fit them into other contexts to use the same logic and understandings of inclusion and exclusion, but beyond the liberal democracies in the West?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that more and more countries want to at least present themselves as being democratic, right? You have all kinds of trends flourishing in liberal democracies, but there's less and less countries that basically say, no, we are an undemocratic authoritarian regime. At least they try to pay lip service to the idea of what it is to be, of the fact that they're democracies. Now, you're right, often it's a very, very thin or even a perverted understanding of what it is to have a democracy. You have elections, but often those elections aren't fair, so I just think that the fight should be for there and here, because of course you have, democratic regression and backsliding in Europe as well. It should be for upholding, democracy, and for upholding a notion of democracy that is, not just a pro forma, that goes together with all the other indicators. We have indexes around the world measuring these things. You call yourself a democracy, but because you have elections, but those elections are not fair. We know that the results have been, decided way in advance. There's repression of political dissidents. There isn't really true freedom of political parties, and there isn't freedom of the press. That is a very weak democracy. So I think, the fight should be for, upholding substantive democratic standards, and that so that should be, I think, the first fight everywhere. But what I would like to see is that in that notion, in that richer notion of democracy, we start incorporating this idea of inclusion of non-national residents within the political body. That's what I would like to see. But the fight is actually for upholding democratic standards all over the world, and not just in the global south, including, in global north. Unfortunately, we have to fight that fight. I think it's very unlikely that you're going to see, you may see instrumental uses of granting suffrage or excluding and including migrants for other purposes. But for the purpose I'm concerned with, it should go hand in hand with sustaining and enriching the notion of democracy everywhere.
Thanks.
Okay, and now we are changing the topic. For those listening who are new in the topic, your recent book is entitled Global Gender Constitutionalism and Women's Citizenship, a struggle for transformative inclusion. My question is how it happened that you started to be interested in this topic. And can you briefly define and explain the concept of gender constitutionalism?
Okay, so I finished my PhD at the UI on migration. I took Germany and the US as case studies, and I had already decided that constitutional law was going to be the domain in which I was going to work, and I basically started experiencing what it means to be a woman and a woman in academia. And so at a certain point, I imagined that my feminist instincts just, opened up. And so I decided to look into this intersection between feminism and constitutionalism. At the time, in some countries, you already had some literature, the US, Canada, Australia. Also in Spain, there was some. It was often considered very marginal to the discipline. And I also had the impression that although comparative constitutionalism was a flourishing field, women weren't really for grounding feminist readings of constitutionalism, in relation or in dialogue with other women in other jurisdictions. So, as things happen, it's always life, it's serendipity. I went to Canada to work after I finished my PhD, and I spent a couple of years in Seville. I went to Canada to work with Will Kimlicka, whom I had met at the UI, and I started working on language rights with him 1 year in Canada. And there I got more and more acquainted with Bev Baines, who is a feminist constitutional scholar. She had been involved in, the Repatriation Act in the Canadian constitutionalism, and, so she came from a long tradition, and she was excited to hear about my own experience in Spain, and we came up with this idea about let's hold a workshop in Sevilla, of all places. And so that's how a little workshop started. It's a beautiful anecdote. We were given 3,000 euros, and I wanted to return the money. I'd asked for 20,000 to organize the workshop. But Sevilla has such a nice appeal that I captured people. People paid their way, and we had a very small gathering. I basically provided food in my house, and we went for street art, and we just did this amazing workshop, and that's where the gender of constitutional jurisprudence came out of that experience. And ever since, I have part of my heart has been on this subject. I'm still doing some work related to migrants, currently working on a handbook on migration and human rights together with other former EUI alumni, so that's really sweet. But yes, gender and constitutionalism became one of my main domains. And the idea of gender constitutionalism, well, there's one reading of it, which is just basically a feminist approach and analysis of constitutional law. I also use it in the book, in my most recent book that you mentioned, to signify that constitutional systems have always had a certain understanding of gender relations embedded in themselves in connection to the structure of the political system.
Okay. So, coming back to your book, you describe the global struggles for women's constitutional rights. Could you summarize the trajectory of these struggles? And what strategies for women's participation in constitution making have you found the most effective?
So in the book, I don't really try to trace, women's struggles for rights across the world, because it would be an impossible task. I'm actually a little bit more modest, although I am not very modest at all, because as you know, I start from the origins of written constitutions, and I bring us to the contemporary times. What I try to track is the ways in which women have attempted to use constitutions to push for their visions of equality, and in what ways constitutions have served women or betrayed women in closing down rather than opening venues for the affirmation of their rights. And so what I do in the book is that I trace certain dividing line between what I called old constitutionalism and new constitutionalism. I started from a very, we started from a very gray or dark place where women were even politically enfranchised, so they weren't even considered part of the political body that had to have a say around constitution making. And that then changes slightly when, women gain a right to suffrage and therefore can be part at least of, those who elect, who are, the people who are going to draft constitutions. But I basically, trace or identify a moment when, constitution making processes start to being more inclusive, more participatory in general, not just regarding women, but in general, taking on board civil society's voices and movements. And that's where I see that the feminist agenda starts making a more clear inroad in constitutional texts. So we're talking turn of the century. Latin American countries have been a very fertile ground of exploration because they had a later coming to constitutional democracies after the dictatorships in the late 80s and onwards. And so, I can see that those are moments in which the conditions are set for women to have a stronger voice. But one point I make in the book, and that I would like to very clearly make in this interview, is that whether or not women have been part of the constitution-making body, or, the assembly, the constitutional assembly that, discusses the constitutional text, or the small group of constitutional drafters, right? Those who prepare the founding fathers, right? Those who prepare the text of the draft of the Constitution. Women have had ideas and opinions and have mobilized in different ways throughout history, including when they didn't have the right to suffrage, in order to craft their visions about what the Constitution should contain, often through civil society mobilization, often gathering, creating platforms, trying to have then, input into the constitution making process, sending letters, lobbying, and often getting together to actually craft a constitution that they would then put together in a physical document and try to push to have an input. And that story has not been told and has never been foregrounded in, our accounts of constitutional law.
My next question is similar to the last Vicky's question on context beyond the West. So how does your global constitutionalism concept relate to women's rights struggles elsewhere? For instance, in Iran and Afghanistan, where we can observe ongoing political struggles for women's rights to education, and for their broader participation in the public sphere. So how do these events fit into your framework?
So I think one thing that is important to understand is that, constitutionalism plays a relatively modest role, right? It's the main law or the fundamental law in each country. It actually has very different normative forces in various jurisdictions. In some of them, it's more of a symbolic kind of document out there. But in most countries, I would say, if you want to really understand the progress in terms of women's rights, probably you should look more at legislation and even at implementation of legislation. That's really where, most things happen. Which is not to say that when you have what we call a constitutional moment, so that is a moment where a major constitutional revision or a new constitution is being drafted, you have what we could call opportunity structures, to have some input, to have some, impact on what you think the fundamental norm should contain that encapsulates your vision of a just society, of a fair society. So I think that, it is not a feature of just, the Western world. I think that, the idea that countries should have a constitution is a universal idea. Every country has its constitution. And what you find is that depending on, how the process is, some processes are very elite driven and very close and behind the doors, right? Versus other that are much more inclusive participatory processes. These define different opportunity structures. You also have civil societies that are much more articulated and women's groups that are much more articulated in some societies than in others when it comes. I'm thinking of your own region of the world, right? Which was having new constitutions, constitutional moments after the fall of the wall, but where women were not necessarily very articulated in civil society as women's groups and were not at all consulted and included in the new constitutions or in the constitutions that were being amended, right? This was a pact among boys, right? Very different from what was happening in some of the countries in Latin America starting in the 90s, Colombia, 91, where you have a very, strong students movement actually, leading in the constitution-making process with lots of consultations and tables and documents that were being filtered. So across the world, what you find is different sets of opportunity structures that hinge on how the constitution-making process is designed, but also on how the civil society is structured and how women's movements in each specific moment is articulated, as well as on the degree of penetration of international norms, and transnational women's movements within each society. So I think it's a global phenomenon, but of course the opportunity structures are very different and are specific to each country and each society.
So staying a bit with this region of Central and Eastern Europe that you mentioned, in recent years, scholars who are writing about women's rights, they are using the term gender backlash. it's not a surprise because of two recent judgments on abortion. I mean, it's U.S. Supreme Court decision in Dobbs v. Jackson and Polish Constitutional Court who limited right to abortion. So considering your book, I have a question, and recent events, I have a question if you are in favor of using the term gender backlash. Because
So I think, technically speaking, I think the idea of backlash suggests the idea that you have achieved a certain milestone and that you're being sent back. And that part of being sent back is a reaction of women's empowerment. And so there's a counter reaction. And I think that is that is an accurate term to describe, many of the things. I do think that part of the reason why there's this movement to counter what has been identified as gender ideology, right? Where you lump lots of things together, same-sex marriage and sexual education and women's reproductive rights, is because there have been gains since the turn of the century. We now see same-sex marriage more and more normalized. We see, reproductive autonomy being more, strongly recognized, even in countries like, Ireland. So I do think that part of what you see is a rejection and is a protest against some of these evolutions. It's true that sometimes you see the term backlash used in a little, broader terms where it may be technically more dubious. So, in some instances, what you have is more like a preemptive step rather than a backlash. In your region, as you know, there's been, I think is it 8 constitutions that have been amended to make sure that same-sex marriage does not become an option, even in countries where it wasn't even politically on the agenda, right? So the idea is this is spreading in Europe and elsewhere. It's a global evil, and we have to take preemptive strikes. Maybe there the term backlash is a bit less accurate in the sense that what you're doing is preemptively, act so as to prevent certain changes rather than react once those changes have taken place.
Okay. Probably I'm not the first person who is asking you this question, because one of the most debatable issues in the contemporary feminist movement is the question of intersectionality. So the relation between women's rights and discrimination and inequalities based on sexual orientation, race, or class position. How does gender constitutionalism relate to broader LGBTQ rights, racial justice, and economic inequalities?
Well, that's a very broad question because you bring on board so many axes of discrimination and inequality. I mean, one thing I would say is that I think this certain elements of the what defines structurally the gender order, this idea of a separate spheres and the idea that women's primary domain in activity and citizenship expression should be, reproductive work, I think is universal, as much as I think that, the phenomenon of violence against women is also universal. So I think that there's in spite of all the intersectionality, I still think there are forms of expression of the idea that society should be structured in a gendered way with gender roles and unequal gender-based relations that are that we can say are universal features, right? In this moment of intersectionality, it seems that we lose the idea of womanhood in this sense, and I want to reclaim that, and I know it's controversial. Now, that said, I do think, of course, that there's additional elements to this. Yes, women have been pushed into reproduction and caretaking, but some women haven't been able to stay in their homes to take care of their kids because they were pushed into other women's homes. Whiter women or wealthier women, they still end up statistically putting up with a significantly larger amount of care work and reproductive work in their homes and outside of their homes. I think that the LGBTQ axis is very central to the idea of gender order. And in fact, there are sections of the book that discuss same-sex marriage, but also gender identity, because in this her story of constitutionalism, when I describe the ways in which this foundational gender order is gradually challenged, of course, the more you claim gender equality and you challenge gender role and you challenge especially the marital, reproductive, heterosexual family as a foundational cell of society, the more natural, it becomes to give constitutional recognition to other forms of marriage and to other forms of, gender identity. So it is part of it. The racial axis, of course, we're talking about women that should include, racialized women. Some of the debates, I think, are very relevant to racialized women. So when I talk about motherhood, there's a section on positive motherhood, which is basically saying, well, it's okay to discuss abortion rights and reproductive autonomy, which is the right not to be a mother if one doesn't want to. But we have to bear in mind that for many women, the problem has been that they have been considered second-class mothers and that they have undergone, enforced sterilization or other forms of eugenics interventions, and that therefore, a feminist, a rich feminist notion of motherhood in the Constitution should encompass both the right not to be mothers, but also the right to be mothers, right? And to have the collectivity and the state ensure equal access to motherhood and not just, some kind of a contraceptive understanding of reproduction. So some of these elements are core. I would imagine, of course, when you discuss violence against women, there's a disparate impact against racialized women, so it has a disparate impact against them. The social inequality issue, I think, comes in various ways. I think it comes, for instance, in substantive notions of equality that women have been foregrounded. Women have also, whenever they have had the chance to intervene in constitution-making process, have been natural defenders of social rights. Because when the state doesn't provide, the by-default provision comes from the family, meaning from women providing. So having education, having health, having homes is key to everyone, but especially for women who are the natural substitute of care provision. So, but of course, that said, I think in liberal, contemporary liberal constitutionalism, the whole social dimension right now would need to be significantly strengthened to make that constitutionalism transformative also from a gender perspective. It cannot be just focusing on so-called, first, second generation rights. Unless you bring on board strong social rights, it doesn't matter what else you do, it's going to be very little transformative from a gender perspective. The social economic inequality axis has to be absolutely foregrounded.
Okay, thank you. To wrap up our interview, I would like to finish with a question on current challenges that you can see for women's constitutional rights.
Yeah. Well, the first challenge has to do with something we were already discussing, which is this backlash. In the book, I identify various constitutional techniques that conservative groups and populist groups and governments are relying on to combat, right? They see that there's been constitutional progress. They see that this phenomenon of the disestablishment of the foundational traditional gender order has taken place, and they're smartly co-opting the language of human rights, of constitutional rights, and of constitutional identity to undermine some of this progress. So I think a serious contemporary challenge has to is the one of combating this. And this, of course, brings me to the other challenge that I would like to mention, which is the internal division within the feminist movement, along various questions, but, paradigmatically so nowadays, the question between, trans-inclusionary, trans-exclusionary is a question that we know is bitterly dividing the feminist movement. And I actually think that, the feminist movement should be capacious enough to include different voices and perspectives on various questions, including this one, while not forgetting that the bigger, larger enemy is outside. And it's very well articulated. It relies on lots of funding schemes that, are, and funding flows that are very well organized. And it's rubbing its hands to see feminists internally divided in a very bitter, aggressive way. So I would like to call on our feminist forebears who were defenders of peace, and also to say, we can do better in the way we manage our differences, and we should have an order of priorities that is clear. And maybe some of these divisions on some of these differences are strong, but maybe it is time that we step back and we think, what is the order of priority that I attach to this item versus these other items around which we can still unite, which are many. The care agenda, the care economy is yet to be invented. We thought that COVID was offering a platform for that. Violence against women is not going anywhere. It's still a global phenomenon, killing thousands of women in the world. And honestly, combating those who are challenging, feminist progress should become priority number one, because, it's like we're fighting on the Titanic while the boat is gradually sinking.
And it was our last question. So on behalf of the Max Weber program here at the EUI, thank you so much for taking the time to agree to this interview and for sharing your insights based on decades of research. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.